Today's section of the textbook is titled, What Makes Anthropology Anthropological? It's a lot of syllables at the end. Now, we've seen that anthropology is the study of human beings, which I told you in the last class is too big, it's too huge. And so we've seen how anthropology divides itself often into biological anthropology, archaeology, cultural anthropology, and linguistic anthropology, so the four subfields. In this section, we talk about, okay, so these are the topics of study, but what makes something an anthropological study as opposed to, say, a biological study of human beings or a historical study of human beings? They come up with a few answers. One of them we talked about, and they talked about before, is that all of the subfields are concerned with this idea of culture, or how we get to behave the way we do. In anthropology, we generally emphasize the role of learning, that this is something that we learn to do. We may not realize we're learning it, and it is often something we have learned to do long before we get into a classroom and school and are able to take notes. We're just seeping it up from our society. And it gets so learned that we don't even think about it anymore. It becomes completely natural. The other way to think about this is how much we swim in a world of symbols, of meanings. We're able to do things with symbols that apparently other creatures don't really do, for better or worse, right? So there are no other creatures who, just because of some symbols written on a piece of paper or now sent via email or text, would be able to organize themselves so that they are running around to one place, all sitting down, paying attention, and then something is going to happen at a certain time, and the lights are going to go out, and then you'll do something else for a while, and then come back at another time. Like, it's impossible to imagine chimpanzees, dogs, ants organizing themselves in such a way that I could tell the dogs to gather here again at 11:30 a.m., right? That is high-level symbolic behavior. And we seem to be able to organize ourselves and do things based on these arbitrary, agreed upon symbols. So it's very important for biological anthropologists to understand, well, how did this happen biologically, evolutionarily? It's something we look for in the archaeological record. Sometimes difficult to tell, but drawings and paintings on pottery. How is it that societies are organizing themselves through the use of symbols? Of course, it's perhaps more obvious with linguistic anthropology and the use of language, which may be the most important symbolic system that we use as humans, and cultural anthropology, where we gather a set of norms, like taking our shoes off when we come into a room, that would be a norm, or gather these norms and symbols into something that we might consider a whole culture or a society. So the role of learned behavior, culture, symbolic behavior is important for all the subfields of anthropology. The textbook also outlines what they call core values and practices that anthropology shares and that makes anthropology anthropological across the subfields. We'll be talking about these in order and in more depth, but they outline them here quite helpfully for us. The first being a concern with stuff that happens outside of libraries and classrooms, that you need to go and do something we call field work. The second, that anthropology is comparative. It's going to compare different societies, different places, perhaps even across species, and certainly over time as well. The third example they call embracing many different scholarly traditions. I'm going to shorten that to what I hope is anthropology is generous in terms of trying to think about how other people use knowledge and knowledge systems. So in addition to the scientific approach, We use a humanistic approach, or we consider local knowledges, different knowledge systems. And so anthropology tends to be, in relation to some of our sterner disciplines, you might say, more open-minded, hopefully, about the ways in which people come to know their world. The fourth aspect, they talk about this in different ways, and later on they will talk about making research relevant or research for positive change, to somehow that anthropological research should respond to needs in the people of the communities in which we are working or we are being studied or studying. The last part is about anthropological ethics and how you need to behave as an anthropologist, both to your colleagues, people around you, but especially to the people you are studying with. What are the ethical obligations that you have as an anthropologist? So these are the 5 big things they talk about. Okay. So we talked about this field work as something that occurs outside of the lab, office, classroom, is crucial because for various reasons, most studies of other people have been done in Western societies. If you see, for example, a psychological study, it's often been done on US undergraduates who are hardly representative of the world's diversity. A lot of stuff has happened that has never been written down, and you can only get so much out of the archaeological evidence. So anthropology has always considered it important to go into different places where things either haven't been studied, haven't been recorded, or have been ignored. Societies are always changing. So you might do your field work in one place at one particular time. It's important to note, as we just heard about symbolic change, let us say in Bangladesh, that societies change over time. So you don't want to just rely on something that has been done 20 years ago. Might be different now. This keeps us focused, makes us question our biases, makes you understand that you might have assumptions that you went into before you went into the field. The textbooks gives us an example of Dr. Lawrence Ralph. Many anthropologists are known for doing fieldwork in non-Western or other societies, but this can occur in our own society as well. US society, Dr. Ralph does his fieldwork in US cities and trying to understand issues of gang violence, gang-related violence. And this leads us to the notion that anthropologists have of cultural relativism, which is to say that we want to, as we're doing our fieldwork, to try to assess people in the context of their own learned behavior. It's very similar to the idea of walking a mile in somebody else's shoes before you judge them, or simply trying to understand what someone else is doing from their own perspective before you impose your perspective on theirs. I want to immediately be careful here. That doesn't mean that we say anything goes and all cultures are equally good. It's simply a way of trying to understand people's values in context. So when Dr. Lawrence Ralph is researching gang-related violence, he's trying to understand the dynamic and why it may be making sense in a particular location. That doesn't mean you say, oh, that's their culture, that's fine. It means you're trying to understand it in part because you may be wanting, as we'll find out in a second, to make positive change in that situation. So it's not the same as what we might consider moral relativism or philosophical relativism. It's simply trying to understand people from their own perspective, but you may not necessarily want to adopt that perspective. You're simply trying to understand it from within. Second set of issues has to do with the comparative perspective. I grouped you mostly because of your cross-species comparisons. Yeah, right. So that was my next group. Okay. So you all talked about co-sleeping in some ways. What did you come up with? Did you agree in the end? Not all of you believed in this, but what do you think? Okay, good. So anthropology, unlike some other disciplines, compares different societies, even across species. Seems that in other species and other societies where there's less electrical light, people tend to sleep together in groups, have less of a schedule. Some of you said that this even applied to your hometown where there's less light. It also seems that across a species, especially when an infant is first born, those of you who've ever been near an infant in those first weeks and months of life, they have this really weird kind of breathing and their heartbeat is bizarre. But if they are close to you, their breathing and their heartbeat tend to sync up with their whoever they're close to. And so in many societies, co-sleeping with an infant is a pretty normal behavior. In our society, we've been told that we shouldn't, and I just saw a sign for this on a bus that you should be on your back in a crib. We think that this is dangerous. I'm not here to give out medical advice, but it seems like if you do it right, and that means you got to get rid of these big comforters and these soft mattresses and stuff like that, it can be helpful and beneficial for at least for the first months of life. However, be careful, I guess you would say. But this enables us to say, to make different recommendations for people based on these kinds of comparisons. I want to add here the historical comparison aspect. They don't talk about this as much. Probably it falls into the cross-cultural a little bit, but comparing our own or other societies, what people were doing 20, 30, 100 years ago with today is often also very helpful to do. All right. As I said, I renamed embracing diverse scholarly traditions as generous. Anthropology has our people who do the science part of things, where you test a hypothesis, see if you can falsify the hypothesis. So some people are way into that, but we also embrace a more, could we call a more humanistic side, which depends on your personal experiences and the meanings that people have for different phenomena they experience. These are a little bit more difficult to falsify. We don't say that everybody's meaning and experience is true. However, you're not going to go out and just say you're wrong, or you can't really falsify somebody's experience. If that's what they think, that's what they think. The anthropologist Eric Wolf, who they quote here, called anthropology the most scientific of the humanities and the most humanistic of the sciences, trying to straddle that line or incorporate both into our work. We also try to consider not just what we might call Western style science, but to think about how other peoples have their own knowledge systems and their own practices, which may have grown up in a particular environment, and to take that seriously as a form of knowing the world. It might be plant-based knowledge or knowledge about climate or knowledge about other species, or even what life is composed of, to just think about that as in a serious way. So that ideally, when anthropologists are doing field work, what we are trying to do is to create knowledge with people. So we like to say, at least these days, that we study with people. We're not just studying other people, extracting knowledge as if they are insects or a different species. We're trying to talk and engage with people in order to co-produce knowledge. So on this score, ideally, and it goes with the last point, we are not simply studying people for the knowledge that we want to extract from them, but talking to people in order to understand what they would like to do. There's a couple different versions of this. One is something that is called applied anthropology, where you do your research and then try to use it to solve a problem. Another part of it is called activist anthropology, where you're doing research and then you're trying to help people make political change. The textbook is a difficult example of an anthropologist who worked with a school in which particularly African American students would go missing or later found to be buried there. And going through this process, eventually, this is a picture of the anthropologist and the mayor embracing, encouraging healing across this community. So it will hopefully result in good outcomes or relevant research for the community. There are other ways in which anthropology is used. One of the ways that they talk about in the textbook is to support law enforcement, so people who do forensic work. Some people use anthropology to influence government policy. Many anthropologists who've worked on issues of immigration, for example, and would like to see laws changed with regard to that. And there are also people who work in industry or auto manufacturing to try and understand how people do different work practices. So there's a variety of ways in which research has been conducted anthropologically, either for a community or with an applied angle. Yeah, so ethics, I'm just going to simplify this a little bit. One of the biggest things is try not to hurt other people, especially the people you are doing research with or your colleagues. Don't be harassing people. Don't be bullying them. Don't extract knowledge and give them credit. Don't plagiarize. Right? So try not to harm other people. Sometimes we do this inadvertently, but try not to. And your group said this often involves talking to people about their involvement in the research. And if they don't want to be involved, then they don't have to be. So this is called informed consent, where you try as much as possible to let people know what you're doing and gain their consent to be part of the study. Ideally, like we said before, anthropologists should prioritize the people and the communities who you are studying. You don't want to harm them, and you would like, in some way, the research to be relevant to their actual lives. Yeah, it's that self-reflection part. So that you're trying to think upon what you're doing and trying to reflect, make things better. There's in some ways a reason for this, which we will talk about in the next class as we read the chapter Doing Anthropology. There's a reason why anthropologists have been so concerned about ethics, self-reflection, and not extracting knowledge from people, because in some ways, when anthropology was born as an academic discipline, we unfortunately did do a lot of extraction, not informing people of what they needed to do, etc. So that will be one of the subjects of our next class.